As 1 Samuel chapter 28 opens, King Saul is encamped with his army on the northern slopes of Mount Gilboa. Mount Gilboa is located on the southern edge of the valley of Jezreel, the beautiful valley of Esdraelon, sometimes called the valley of Megiddo. Mount Gilboa is located on the southeastern side of that particular valley, and he's preparing for battle. He's camped near a spring called Harod in order that he might be able to water his troops. The beautiful valley of Jezreel stretches all the way from the Mediterranean Sea almost all the way to the Sea of Galilee. It's about 7 miles wide. It begins way over here at the Mediterranean where Mount Carmel juts out over the sea and reaches all the way in, as I said, almost to the Sea of Galilee. And in that valley are many beautiful little villages, and in one particular village is called Shunem, which we looked at in the lesson past. Around this particular village was encamped the mighty Philistine army, led by Achish. King Saul is preparing to fight his very last battle. And the text of 1 Samuel chapter 28 tells us that King Saul was fearful about the battle that was approaching, and he was terrified because of it. No longer was King Saul a great mighty warrior, standing head and shoulders above all of the people, but King Saul, at this particular point, was a weakling because of a couple of reasons. Number one, as he looked across the valley, he could see the mighty Philistine army led by Achish. They were equipped with horses and chariots. They had blades reaching out of each wheel. Not only so, but his army was simply and only infantry, poorly equipped. But even more so than that, we are told that he feared because God had departed from him, and God did not answer him when he prayed to him. We are told that specifically, that Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him either by dream, by Urim, or by the prophets. Let's notice each of those for just a moment. Sometimes the Lord would make his will known by the dreams that he would give to individuals in the Old Testament period, sometimes in the New Testament period. And he would make his will known by dreams, such as he did to Joseph. Saul, however, no dream was given to him. God did not speak to him at all. Not only so, but the Urim. The Urim and Thummim, those were two lots that were behind the breastplate of the priests. Now the priests had a vest, the high priest had a vest, and that vest was decorated with a breastplate, and on it were 12 stones, one representing each tribe. Behind it, the breastplate, behind the plate, was the Urim and Thummim. These were lots that were cast, and the Lord disposed. The lot was cast into the lap, but the answer of it was given by the Lord, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33. So the Lord sometimes answered by means of the Urim and Thummim. However, how could he even take that avenue of asking the Lord anything regarding that? Because he had slaughtered all of the prophets. Remember earlier in his career, he'd come to the small village of Nob, and the high priest was Ahimelech. Ahimelech had assisted David as David fled from King Saul. King Saul found out about it because of a warrior that he had named Doeg, who was there at Nob, watched what David was assisted by Ahimelech. When Saul came, he slaughtered 85 of those priests for assisting David, including the high priest Ahimelech. Ahimelech had a son by the name of Abiathar. He escaped with what was called the ephod. That would be the high priest's breastplate, as well as the Urim and Thummim, the high priest's accoutrements, that is, the dress that the high priest had, and he escaped to David. So there was no avenue that Saul could have taken to ask God's direction by means of the high priest and the Urim and Thummim. He had murdered all of those priests. Not only so, but God did not speak to him by the prophets. He had had a friend in his earlier years, and that friend was, of course, Samuel. Samuel had aided him, had advised him in his earlier years, had even anointed Saul to be king publicly and privately. He had given him direction. But Saul remembers when Samuel turned his back on him finally, speaking for God. in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, when Saul had disobeyed God concerning the instructions of Amalek, where he was to destroy all of the Amalekites. And Saul tried to get Samuel to stay with him and worship before the people. And Samuel turned and started to leave. Saul grabbed hold of his coat, and it tore in Saul's hands. Samuel said, as the coat is torn in your hand, so the kingdom will be taken from you and given to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. Saul remembered all of that. There was no asking a prophet of God at this point. Consequently, we are told that he inquired of the Lord either by the Urim, by a dream, by a prophet. But heaven was silent to King Saul. Someone might ask the question, sometimes they have, regarding 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 12 through 14, which tells us that Saul did not inquire of the Lord, and therefore the Lord put him to death. That would be at the battle that's about to occur in 1 Samuel chapter 28. And how do we reconcile that Saul did not inquire of the Lord, or Saul did not consult the Lord, 1 Chronicles 10, with what we have in 1 Samuel 28 and verse 6, and that is, Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him. The answer to that apparent discrepancy is simply this, as was pointed out in the Bible reading earlier by Brother Bruce, and that is that 1 Chronicles chapter 10 is a summary statement of Saul's life, of his kingship, of his reign. It's a summary. And the summary is that he had cast the Lord, as the Scriptures would put it, the prophets would say, behind his back. And he would not consult the Lord. He did not take the advice of the prophets. He did not inquire of the Lord. His whole kingship was one of rebellion against God. And now at the last, he asked God to assist him, and heaven was silent. But it does bring up an important principle of the Bible that we all need to see and let it soak into your heart. And that is that God's patience wears out sometimes with the sin of mankind. God's patience has limits. That is not to say that we cannot turn around late in life and repent. But it is to say, as long as people and peoples, such as nations, go on their own way, shaking their fist in God's face, then finally God allows them to enjoy the fruits of their own choices. And God's patience has limits. Wasn't that the way it was in Exodus chapter 32? When they had a golden calf, when Moses came down from the mountain, God said to Moses, stand aside. I'm going to destroy the entire people. I will make of you, Moses, a great nation. And the only reason that did not occur was because of Moses' intercession at that point. God's patience had worn out with the people of Israel. Once again in Numbers chapter 14, as they came to Kadesh Barnea, that would be south of Israel, they're preparing to go up into and launch into Israel and conquer it as God had promised He would be with them. But they said, well, we want to send spies into the land first. Moses tells us later in the book of Deuteronomy, he said, you wanted spies to go in order that you might see the land and you might make an assessment of the peoples. That was their idea. So they sent spies into the land, and as you recall, the 10 spies had an evil report, that is, we can't take the land. There are giants in the land. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, we can take the land, let's go up. God said, no more. You're not going to take the land. I am not going with you. You will not take the land. The people said, well, now we're changing our mind. We'll go up and we'll conquer. Now, okay, we'll go. We'll go to the land. And so they march up to the land, and Moses said, don't go. God is not with you. And they were beaten all the way, the Bible tells us, into a small village of Hormah. That is, they had to run all the way south. He said, everyone will stay in the wilderness and die from 20 years old and upward because they have rejected God. God's patience has limits. Not only that, but we need to note carefully the biblical principle that prayer is a prerogative for faithful Christian people only. Prayer is a prerogative for faithful Christians. Listen to this passage in 1 John chapter 3, verses 21 and 22. where we are told very simply this: if our heart condemn us not, we have boldness toward God, and whatsoever we ask we receive of Him, because we keep His commandments and do the things that according to pleasing to Him. God answers prayer when we keep His commandments and do the things that are pleasing to Him. Prayer is not a prerogative for non-Christians. By the way, while we're on that point, we might just put a peg here, take it aside, and notice this. How is it the case, therefore, that denominational preachers, one and all, will encourage people who are non-Christians to pray for salvation? Prayer is a prerogative for faithful Christian people. 1 John chapter 3, verse 22. Because we keep His commandments and do the things that are pleasing to His sight. That's what prayer is. That's for whom prayer is. Saul, therefore, was in rebellion to God, and God did not hear him. Therefore, Saul began to be afraid even more so. And he cast about for how in the world am I going to get advice from Samuel, my friend of earlier years, since Samuel is now passed away. He asked his staff, is there not a medium, that is, a person who deals with the dead, contacts the dead spirits? Is there not a medium that we can talk to? They went and searched. They found at Endor there was a woman who was a witch, the witch of Endor. And she deals with familiar spirits. She is a medium. Saul prepared that night to go with his two companions all the way to Endor, which was on the north side of the Jezreel Valley. And so Saul prepares to make the journey. One thing you need to note regarding Endor is that Endor is located on a small mountain on the northern edge of the valley of Jezreel. Now remember, Mount Gilboa, where Saul is encamped, is on the southern edge. That means it's about 6 or 7 miles away, but more so than that. It is just on the other side of Mount Moreh, that is on the northern slopes. On the southern edge of that same mountain is the valley, or is the city of Shunem, where the Philistine army is encamped. That means that King Saul himself, the king of Israel, is going to be with two companions, stealthily going by night, right beside the Philistine camp, where he can even hear the horses stomp their feet, some of the sentries talking among themselves, and little did they know that the king of Israel was skirting around their camp that night. They finally come to Endor. Saul has traded his royal robes for the robes of a servant, a lowly servant, apparently putting a hood on over his head, and travels all the way to Endor in the middle of the night. They must go there 7 miles distant and travel back after they receive whatever information that the witch of Endor can give them. They must travel back by morning light and be back. So hurriedly they go on their way. They come to the little village of Endor. Endor is built on the hillside of Mount Moreh. It's a rocky slope. And in the rocky slope, there are caves and caverns where many of the people live. And one of the Hebrew words in 1 Samuel 28 tells us that the witch actually lived in one of those caverns, or in one of the caves that were there located. There was a small village there, and some of the people lived right up in the caves. They led Saul to the witch's cavern. She opens the door, moves the curtain, however it may be, and they enter in. It takes Saul a few moments, I suppose, that his eyes could adjust to the darkness, and what would he see? In a small cave, we know from the rest of the text that we have a small bench sitting beside on one of the walls of the cave. We have small alcoves where her bed was located. There was even a small alcove where a calf was right here munching straw, I suppose. Small calf right inside. There would be a table, and on the table there would be a kneading trough, some dough being prepared for the morrow. But that which was fascinating to Saul was, in the center, apparently would be what we'd call a magic circle, a small fire crackling inside of it. The walls of the cave would be blackened by the soot, smoke wafting out to the door. And Saul asked and begs her, he said, I want you to call up for me whomsoever I may ask. She said, well, why would you lay a trap for me? Why would you lay a trap for me? Because you know that King Saul has put out of the land, and that was the law of God, put out of the land by the death sentence everyone who dealt with familiar spirits, witches, all of those who practiced necromancy, contacting the dead, all of those who practiced astrology. They were to receive the death sentence, and Saul had earlier put them all out of the land. She said, why would you lay a trap for me? You know what King Saul has ordered. He was anxious. He said, be not, and I think this is one of the most horrible scenes of it. He swore by the Lord, as the Lord lives, using the Lord's name as an oath in order to contact the netherworld. As the Lord lives, no harm will come to you. I suppose that she thought that he was a man that was used to being ordering other people around, and so she sat down at the magic circle. I suppose that she would have a trance, and Saul was sitting by breathlessly waiting what was going to occur. And as she began to weave and wobble about, all of a sudden she screams out loud. Saul says, what do you see? She says, I see a God coming up out of the earth. And at the same time she recognizes Saul. You are Saul. Why have you deceived me? He said, don't be afraid. What do you see? What does he look like? She said, he's an old man dressed in a robe. He said, it is Samuel. And he bows himself on the floor. At this point, I want you to notice some things regarding and pertaining to the lesson that we need to note. A couple of things. Number one, there are a couple of lessons we need to note. Number one, we'll look at this one in a moment, and that is forms of witchcraft. But number one, first of all, however, I want you to notice the impact of a godly life. What is the impact of a godly life? You may not recognize it, but your godly life, your godly example that you present now to people can impact and will impact them long after you are gone if you live a life for God. Samuel has been gone and he's been in the grave. But the first thing that Saul thinks about is, what would Samuel say to this? I have personally thought, I wish I could ask my mother one more time, what would you say about this situation? I would like to ask my grandmother, what is your advice? What do you think about this? But it will not be. But your impactful life will influence other people from now on. And it is difficult for us to imagine, but the seeds that we sow will spread abroad. And what we need to remember is that we are not commanded to do anything but spread the seed, whether it be the gospel or our godly influence to other people. And that is all we're called to do. And sometimes those seeds will sprout up and grow later. Sometimes people refer back to the wisdom that we perhaps and hopefully that we might manifest in our lives. So it was with Samuel. What an impactful life. Do you know, in Samuel's life, as far as I am able to read in the book of 1 Samuel, I see no outstanding sin that is accounted to his detriment. I don't see anything in the Old Testament whereby the writer tells us, Samuel, however, did this. Now, I do know one thing, we may ought to put a caveat on that. He had two sons, Joel and Abijah, and they did not follow in the father's track. But be that as it may, we don't have any outstanding sin that Samuel had committed. What a great man of God, and impactful and influencing all the way after he was dead. And so it also can be with you. Number two, I want you to notice regarding witchcraft in the Bible. And people ask the questions, why is witchcraft condemned in the Bible? And lo, it is. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verses 10 and 11, God says this. This is Moses doing the speaking. When you come into the land that God has given you to inherit, you shall not do after the nations that were before you. You shall not have anyone, there shall not be found among you anyone who passes his son or daughter through the fire, that is, offering their children as a sacrifice. You shall not have anyone among you that is a wizard or a witch or a necromancer or dealing with familiar spirits, the Old Testament law was that they would receive the death penalty. And the question is, why is that the case? And here's the answer, and that is because it is God who controls the world, and it is God to whom we should turn. And anything other than that really is a detriment to our understanding of how God controls the world. And actually is an effort for us to take power from God and His influence and His control and give it to something else, a demonic spirit. There are only two different avenues that we can go. There is God and there is Satan. And if we're not going to rely upon God, then we're going to rely upon Satan. And all the forms of witchcraft, astrology, they are of Satan. And the Bible roundly condemns it. As a matter of fact, we'll notice one of the passages in just a moment. So let's notice the 6 forms of witchcraft in the Old Testament. 6 forms of it. They're number 1, divining the liver. That would be from Ezekiel chapter 21:21. That is, they would split a liver. That is, take a liver, the lengthwise, and split it open. What would that do? Well, they would read the vein pattern on it. Just like people today supposedly reading palms, they would read the vein pattern on the liver and say, this is what the gods want. Ezekiel talks about it when he tells us the king of Babylon is coming down to Jerusalem. Now remember, he is in Babylon. He's speaking about what's going to happen to his people in Jerusalem. He says, they've come up to the north and they split the liver. And they decide we're going to go to Jerusalem. And he's telling his people it's going to be destroyed. Splitting the liver. Divining from water. Remember Joseph, when he had a cup and he put it in Benjamin's sack? What was the cup for? He said, I use it for divining. They put water in it, something like oil on top of it, and the pattern that would flow. Certain people had ability to read the pattern and were able to tell events regarding the future and secret events, mysterious things. So divining from water. The use of arrows. I would think it like pick up sticks, but they would just throw arrows out on the ground, and the pattern, someone would come in, be able to read the pattern that supposedly was thrown out haphazardly, but no, there's a pattern and it means this. Or there is teraphim. What were teraphim? Teraphim were small household idols, small gods, so to speak, and they were actually used for property ownership, but they used them also to pray through. Small little idols. We see them sometimes in different yards right here in Wichita Falls. People have small little idols of Mary sitting around teraphim. That's what they were. Little idols. Or astrology. Listen to this one. Isaiah chapter 47 and verse 13. He says regarding the Babylonians going to destroy Jerusalem, and he's speaking to the people of the Jews. He says, let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators, let them stand up and save you from the things that are coming upon you. In other words, they had relied upon black magic, witchcraft, divining spirits, and not God. He said that you're going to be destroyed because of it. And then necromancy. Necromancy was touching the dead or contacting somehow the spiritual realm. And it breaks into 2 different portions. Some of them were simply honoring the spirits, the spirit world. Even though the Bible says they have nothing to do with this world, they wanted to contact or honor the spirits. For example, the Pew Research Center tells us in a very recent study that in places like Vietnam and the Philippines and in Japan, specifically in Vietnam, where Buddhism has been the main religion for so long, even those who are now Christian, 85% of those individuals, 85% are burning candles to their ancestors and seeking to please the ancestors sometimes by putting food out for their ancestors to participate in. Their dead ancestors. What is it? There's some Roman Catholic priests that are there say, well, we don't want to call it worship, we'll call it veneration because it's too close to the worship of Mary. There was, of course, in the Middle Ages, one of the emperors of Constantinople said, we're going to stop this worship of Mary, we're going to stop the idol worship. They didn't go, however, it continued on. So that's one area, and that is simply honoring the dead. Another one would be contacting the dead for information of how to manage our lives. And that's exactly what's going on, for example, in the Mexican culture right now. In Mexico, that's common practice. That's exactly what necromancy is. Consequently, Saul now has Samuel come up. The witch of Endor, God, I suppose, has simply allowed it. And Saul falls on his face before Samuel. Oh, well, there goes my clicker. Take one. Yeah, there we go. So Saul falls on his face before Samuel. Samuel makes the statement, "Why have you disquieted me in calling me up?" Saul said, "I am about to fight against the Philistines. They are there with Achish and the mighty army in the valley of Jezreel, and I don't know what to do." Samuel gives the immortal answer. He says, "God has not answered you. God is not going to answer you. Why will you ask me?" But Saul begs him to give him an answer, and Samuel gives him this one. He says, "Tomorrow you and your sons are going to be with me." And Saul continues to lay flat. Samuel disappears. They can't get Saul off the ground. He is depressed. He knows that his death is at hand. They beg him to eat. The witch of Endor comes over, begs him to eat. He doesn't want anything to eat. They finally assist him off of the floor and put him against the wall on a bench. And he sits there with a very depressed disposition. Finally, the witch prepares something to eat. She kills the calf, feeds him something, and heads back in the middle of the night. The epilogue, of course, is that Saul dies at Mount Gilboa, just as was mentioned by Samuel. But the main point of the lesson is we have profiles of faith and courage. We have the profile of a great and godly man, Samuel, whose profile continues even after he was dead and influenced Saul. So also they influence us today with their godliness, the way that they live, with their statements and their steadfastness to the Lord. Saul had rebelled against God. He had rebelled against God's advice through Samuel, and the end came, and the end came very swiftly. If we do not turn around in this country, and if individuals do not turn around, the end will be the same for us as it was for King Saul and the entire Israelite army on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. That's what the lesson is, profiles in faith and courage. What a great man is Samuel, influencing even after he was dead. If you're not a Christian, now it's time to make it right by faith, repentance, baptism into Christ. You can become a Christian. If you're not faithful, now's the time to make it right while we stand and sing the song as led by Brother Clint.